Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. When people say I do in a marriage ceremony, they're optimistic about the future. What happens when I do turns into I don't? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Couples who are struggling in their marriage are under tremendous pressure to stay together no matter what. Friends, family, and colleagues may give them unsolicited advice about why they should work things out.
Our guests today will talk about the arguments that are presented to rationalize staying together instead of separating. They question the assumptions and conventional wisdom about divorce. Is it crucial for couples to stay together for the sake of the kids?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out what happens when sacred vows turn into sacred cows.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, should every American over age 40 be taking a statin drug to lower cholesterol? The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has just come out with recommendations that doctors consider a statin for anyone between 40 and 75. Whether or not the physician prescribes such a drug should depend on whether patients have cardiovascular risk factors that would put them at 10% or higher chance of a heart attack over the next 10 years. There's not enough data for the task force to determine whether older adults beyond the age of 75 benefit from statins. Some experts are concerned that people at advanced ages are more vulnerable to possible side effects, such as muscle pain, weakness, cataracts, and diabetes. Heart disease is still a major killer in the U.S., although statins can lower the risk, especially for people who've already had a cardiovascular event. They can't undo the harm from smoking, a sedentary lifestyle, or a poor diet.
A big study called HOPE-3 assessed the effects of statins and blood pressure-lowering drugs on cognitive function in older people. The investigators tracked 1,626 people taking blood pressure drugs, a statin called Crestor, or a placebo. These volunteers were at least 70 years old at the start of the study when they took tests of psychomotor processing speed and executive function. After 5 to 6 years, they were tested again to determine whether the medications had slowed cognitive decline. Disappointingly, there was no difference between the groups. Even though the blood pressure medication lowered blood pressure well and the Crestor effectively lowered cholesterol, there was no benefit for cognitive function. On the other hand, people taking Crestor did no worse than those on placebo, putting to rest fears that statins can damage memory.
There's new evidence of a link between the gut and the brain. A pilot study conducted in Iran found that eating probiotic-rich yogurt helped people with Alzheimer's disease improve their scores on standard cognitive tests. The study yogurt contained 4 active probiotic species. The control subjects consumed untreated milk. The study lasted for 3 months. At the end of it, the participants who had gotten the yogurt scored modestly better on the test than they had at the start, while those who had gotten the milk scored slightly worse. The difference was statistically significant. Those getting the probiotics also lowered their triglycerides, C-reactive protein, and very low-density lipoprotein. Repairing the ecology of the digestive tract might be one approach to helping people with Alzheimer's disease.
A large study supervised by cardiologists at the Cleveland Clinic compared 3 popular pain relievers to see which was riskiest for the heart. Over 24,000 patients were included in this randomized controlled trial that involved Celebrex, ibuprofen, and naproxen. The participants were at high risk for heart attack, strokes, or cardiovascular death. At the end of the trial, there was no difference between the 3 pain relievers when it came to cardiovascular outcomes. The researchers concluded that Celebrex was non-inferior to other NSAIDs when it came to cardiovascular safety. In ordinary language, that means it's no worse than ibuprofen or naproxen, but it's also no better. All NSAIDs carry a risk of cardiovascular complications such as heart attacks and heart failure.
Lots of people have white coat hypertension. Their blood pressure soars when it's measured in the doctor's office, though it's usually much lower if they measure it themselves at home. The treatment of white coat hypertension has been controversial. Some experts believe it's relatively meaningless, while others think that it points to underlying cardiovascular problems and should be treated. A new study of 1,300 people with and without white coat hypertension found problems only for older folks with this intermittent high blood pressure. Those who were over 60 with white coat hypertension and other cardiac risk factors were twice as likely to have a heart attack or a stroke in the following decade. For younger people and those without additional risk factors, white coat hypertension does not appear to be a problem. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. It's estimated that 40 to 50% of marriages end in divorce. Even couples that stay together may not all be happy. There's a lot of pressure from society, though, for people to stay married. What sorts of arguments are made to keep people together in a miserable marriage?
To find out, we turn to Astro and Danielle Teller, co-authors of Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage. Dr. Danielle Teller has held faculty positions at the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University, where she investigated the origins of chronic lung disease and taught in the medical intensive care unit. Dr. Astro Teller is a computer scientist and entrepreneur who currently oversees X. That's part of Alphabet, the umbrella company that also owns Google.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Astro and Danielle Teller.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, we're delighted to be here. Thank you.
Now, I have to tell you, we have seen so many books over the years about marriage and divorce and how to do it right or how not to do it. What makes your book so different?
Well, we certainly have a very different background from most people who write divorce books. Neither of us are experts in any way. And I think the book came from a slightly different motivation than I think many books do. We both went through divorces, and we had a lot of conversations about how many of the narratives in society about marriage and divorce didn't really make sense to us anymore once we were going through that process ourselves. And we realized that we even held on to a lot of those narratives until we examined them in the light of our own experience. And we looked for wisdom in the world that meshed with what we were experiencing and talking about. And since we couldn't find it, we said, well, gee, maybe we should write a book that might help people in the situation that we're currently in.
And we approached this, Danielle is a physician scientist and I'm a computer scientist, so we approached it not from the perspective of being experts in marriage or divorce, but from the perspective of scientists trying to understand and break down into its component parts and potential inconsistencies the actual subject matter in a maybe hopefully dispassionate and organized way.
Now, when you say narratives, what do you mean? Give us an example, please.
So one example would be that marriage is hard work. And implied in that is that if you fail to keep your marriage together, that you weren't working hard enough. And so we just started to talk about where did that come from? Where does this idea about marriage being hard work and the virtue in marriage being industrious come from? Because it wasn't actually really our experience.
Now, your cover is quite extraordinary because, it's sacred vows, remove the vows and insert cows. So, sacred cows, the truth about divorce and marriage. It's a wonderful concept, but help us understand what you mean when you say sacred cows.
So the basic thesis of the book is that there are a whole set of reasons why one ought to try to avoid getting divorced, which we don't really address, but that's certainly true. It's very emotionally painful. It's financially expensive. And we don't take issue with those. But there's a separate set of reasons that are presented to people who are considering whether their marriage is working for them that are bogus. They're boogeymen. They're set up by society as fake reasons to try to create fear and shame on the part of anybody considering ending their marriage so that they won't consider it. And we needed to come up with a way of helping to explain what those fake narratives were, these boogeymen that society had created to try to create this fear and shame. And in the end, we came around to the idea of calling them sacred cows rather than boogeymen, and personifying the 7 main narratives as we saw it as these characters, literally imagining 7 cows with their own personalities, each of which has an agenda to perpetrate some of these fake stories in society to create that fear and shame that will scare people back into their marriages.
Well, I love the idea of the sacred cows, and I especially like the fact that you gave them individual personalities. So will you introduce us to a few of them, please?
Sure. The holy cow is the first character that you might meet if you read the book. And she is a cow who believes that the commitment of marriage is a great social good and that it should take precedence over the pursuit of happiness. And divorce means failure, and married people are better people than divorced people. We get into a little bit about marriage contracts and what we actually promise when we promise to love somebody forever, and how that doesn't hold up to the light of logic very well. But that's her in a nutshell.
Another example might be the selfish cow. So there's this concept that in any discussion in which 2 people are talking about whether or not to maintain or end their marriage, whoever is on the side, quote unquote, of continuing the marriage is by definition in our society the selfless one, and whoever is considering leaving the marriage is the selfish one. And that turns out not to stand up to the kind of basic scrutiny of thought experiments. And so in that chapter, one of the things that we do is just give people a couple examples where it's very obvious that the person who's choosing to stay in the marriage, who's trying to get the other person to stay in the marriage, is actually the selfish one. Now, we're not actually suggesting that people who try to maintain their marriage are selfish people, only to debunk this fake narrative in society that the selfish cow likes to perpetrate on us, which is if you want to end your marriage, you are necessarily a selfish person.
One of the things that I find fascinating about the cows, the sacred cows, is that in essence you are questioning assumptions and conventional wisdom, and these are sort of the bedrock of our society. And so I guess society has created these sacred cows for a reason. Why are we so reluctant to challenge the conventional wisdom and these sacred cows, like the holy cow?
I think because they've become enmeshed in our culture, and I think that we're all brought up with these assumptions, and it's very hard to let go of things that your culture has told you are important. But what's happened is that over the last century or so, the way we approach marriage and divorce has radically changed from what it used to be. Marriage used to be an institution that was really important to maintaining wealth and growing wealth within families. And also it was important, especially for women, in order to do many of the things that women don't need marriage to do now, which is, have sex, have children, own property. There were a lot of reasons why marriage was really, really important. And now people get married for love, which well, I'm sure people in the past also got married for love sometimes, but that wasn't the primary reason that people would get married. And now people who are not in love will just say, well, I'm just not going to get married. And people who are no longer in love will say, I don't want to stay married. And yet we've carried forward with us from past centuries many of these ideas surrounding commitment and so on. And I think that in American society, we kind of want to have it both ways. We're big on the pursuit of happiness, but we also want to maintain a lot of these older values. And we take the perspective that both are fine and legitimate perspectives, but where the cows are a little obnoxious is where they're hypocrites, where they don't admit that they're trying to have it both ways.
Well, you know what's so fascinating is you talk about the romantic comedy Sleepless in Seattle. Tell us why that's such a wonderful example of the hypocrisy.
So exactly as Danielle just described, if you want to go through life with the perspective that marriage is this social contract and that's really the bedrock as you want to see it, fine, that's a legitimate perspective. If you want to see it as the pursuit of happiness, fine, that's acceptable too. But in Sleepless in Seattle, we see this character, the female protagonist, who is engaged to be married to somebody who she's kind of into but not crazy about. And then she hears this voice on the radio and decides that this is the love of her life. And we cheer her on in dumping her fiancé very soon before they get married to run off to meet a guy she's never met. And this is an incredibly romantic movie. Now do the thought experiment where instead of a week or two before the wedding, she runs off to be with this guy she's never met a week or two after the wedding. We all have this incredibly negative reaction to that. That's no longer a romantic comedy. It now has to be a tragedy. There are no movies that function that way in our society. And that shows the hypocrisy that we are trying to have two different bedrocks in our society. We have this one bedrock right up to the moment you get married, which is it's all about throwing caution to the wind and doing whatever it takes to find the love of your life, no matter how complicated it might be. But then once you're married, that narrative dies like it never existed. And now the only narrative that matters is the contract of marriage. There's like a bait and switch where you start with one story and then all of a sudden you find yourself on a different playing field.
And even that would be okay if we would be honest with people and say, look, it's just important to us as a society that you stay married. We know you're not in love with this guy. We know you would be much happier with somebody else, but just do it for us. But instead of saying that, we say, oh, there's no such thing as true love. Nobody could possibly make you happier than the person you're married to. Whereas 2 weeks before, we were like, oh, dump that guy and go with your true love. So that's the hypocrisy.
You're listening to Danielle and Astro Teller. They're co-authors of Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll consider how marriage contracts compare to business contracts.
What's left unsaid, and why are the promises so vague?
We'll also learn about sacred cows like the innocent victim cow.
We'll consider the expert cow. Does the marriage counselor have the same priorities as the couple?
Having a conversation about goals could be the best place to start counseling if it's needed.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1059. The number again, 800-732-2334, or you can make your purchase online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking about marriage and the kinds of arguments that people make to discourage divorce. Our guests are Danielle and Astro Teller, co-authors of Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage.
Astro, Danielle, we talk about a marriage contract, but in most cases, this is kind of a metaphor. There usually isn't a literal contract, and if there were, it wouldn't really hold up as contract law. I mean, you would never sign any other kind of contract that didn't have a termination clause, would you?
The whole point of a contract is to pre-negotiate future friction. When everybody's happy, you don't need a contract, so the entire point of the contract is to pre-agree what you will do if there are disagreements. And the marriage contract is a dysfunctional contract because we leave unsaid what we actually mean, and the reason is because it's not something we can promise. What we want the other person to promise us is that we'll be safe, that they will love us forever. That's what would make me safe if Danielle would love me forever. But she doesn't have control of whether she loves me. So that's not actually in her power to promise me that. So we leave the marriage contract super vague, or worse, she actually does promise me something she actually has no control over, that she'll love me forever. A real contract could sound like, I promise to try to love you forever, and if I stop loving you, I'll tell you about it promptly. That's not a very romantic thing to say, but that's actually something I could live up to. Or, I promise to stay with you for the rest of my life, no matter how miserable it makes me. Then if at some point in the future I choose to leave my marriage, she has a much clearer reason to be pissed off at me than if I stopped being in love with her. But we don't say any of those things because those are just horrible, icky, and specific. So we leave it vague. And the problem with leaving it vague is later, when one person decides the marriage isn't working out for them, there is great disagreement about what it is they promised each other at the beginning because the promise wasn't very crisp.
Is there any way to do anything about that?
The way to fix it, I guess, would be to be much more specific, as Astro suggested. But I don't see that happening because it's not very romantic. So I think rather than trying to fix what people say to each other on the day of the marriage, probably what's more constructive is for those two people beforehand to get together and talk to one another about what would happen if they stopped loving one another, to actually address the elephant in the room, as it were.
So you have a number of cows, and we've only touched on a couple of them, these sacred cows, and one of them is the innocent victim cow, and that is the concept that divorce harms children. And I think that that's a commonly held belief, and I've met a number of people who basically said we were miserable together, but we stayed together for the good of the children. And then we got divorced after they went to college. Can you help us understand a little bit about the innocent victim cow?
Sure. This is the cow that we get the most pushback about. I think this is the one that people cling to the most strongly. And, we're careful to say that everybody's family situation is different. And I think there probably are situations where it is in the best interest of the children for a couple to stay together. But what we address in the book is this idea that there are scientific studies that have proven that when parents get divorced, the children are doomed to having lower academic achievement, more behavioral problems, more criminal activity, to not being able to hold relationships together themselves, and that somehow this act of divorcing is causing a long trail of dysfunction for the children later in their lives. And it turns out that that's just not true. There is no good scientific evidence that the divorce itself is a cause of any of these sorts of long-term effects. And a lot of that is because it's just so hard to study something like divorce, because you can't randomize people to get divorced or not. You can't send them a letter in the mail and say, well, you're randomized to getting divorced next week and you're randomized to staying married for at least 10 years, and we'll check up on your kids, every 2 years and see how they're doing. So what studies there are observational in nature, and they tend to have a lot of problems. There are a lot of confounders, largely because people who get divorced are not the same as people who get married. And even then, even with these studies being very flawed, the magnitude of the differences that are seen in studies where they purport to show that children whose parents are divorced have more, say, behavioral problems years later, the magnitude of the effect is incredibly tiny. And so, we were just surprised when we delved into the literature to find that this is the case, because we also both believed that it was harmful to children.
I would also add that it's hard for people to accept what Danielle said is true, even though it's very clear when you dig into the literature. It's unarguably true. However, it's so counterintuitive because right after people get divorced, most children are sad. What Danielle is saying is about the long-term consequences of divorce. I don't think anyone, certainly not us, would argue that many children are made sad for at least months, sometimes even a few years, by divorce. But that's not the question. The question is whether they'll end up as happy people or not. And they actually might be worse off. There's just no evidence one way or the other. So saying that it's true that they will end up worse off is what doesn't make any sense.
So there's no real way for us to know. And as you pointed out, divorces are all different. I mean, there are a few couples who actually manage to divorce amicably and negotiate co-parenting afterwards with a minimum of nastiness. And then there are other couples who use the kids as pawns and are incredibly bitter and awful and horrible to each other. And I'm sure that kids who have been used as pawns might not fare as well as kids whose parents have negotiated co-parenting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's evidence that those people will grow up to be criminals, but there is a fair amount of evidence that having parents who have a lot of conflict does make children really unhappy. And that's whether or not the parents are divorced. So having married parents who are fighting all the time has clearly been shown to make kids unhappy.
Married parents who are fighting all the time might conceivably be consulting a marriage counselor. So tell us about the expert cow, if you would, please.
Sure. So just like we said with the innocent victim cow, not there's no way children are worse off after divorce, just that there's no evidence to show it. Many people surely get some benefit from going to see some kind of expert, such as a marriage counselor. There are other kinds of retreats that people go on. But it is the case that there's no evidence that they end up better. So that's not a negation that some people will feel better afterwards. In fact, there's some data that couples state that they are happier after they've gone to one of these counselors. But there's no evidence that going to a counselor increases your chances of staying married in the long run. Some therapists are obviously very thoughtful people who work hard to be professional. But there are experts in the field, including some people who are marriage counselors, who are less aligned with either of the people in the room than they are with the cows. So generally, what we would recommend to people is, if you were going with your spouse or by yourself to talk to an expert about the fact that you're considering ending your marriage, you should ask them, whose side are you on? Are you trying to help me maximize my personal happiness? Are you trying to maximize the happiness, sum or multiplication of me and my spouse? Are you trying to cause us to stay married? Is that your highest purpose? It's fine if the answer is the last one, but I know a lot of people who've ended up going to an expert, wanting to get good advice on how they can be happy. and having run into an expert whose primary purpose was to cause the marriage to continue, whether that made them happy or not. And that person, who was super vulnerable going into this, then ends up feeling pretty ripped off.
Well, I've often wondered whether we'd be better off having, call it what you will, marriage counseling before we get married to find out if we're compatible, if there are some things that need work before we enter this contract, than at a point where we say, this is not working. How do we figure out a way to fix something that's fairly badly broken? Any thoughts about pre-marriage counseling?
I think that having more of these conversations before marriage would help us to avoid a lot of these sacred cows. So just as we spoke about with the marriage contract, having more honest discussions about why we're getting married and what would cause us to decide that we should no longer be married. We don't have those conversations. And I think it is also helpful in certain situations for people to see counselors when they're married, but it has to be goal-oriented, I think. We wrote this chapter because there's this idea in our culture that everything can be fixed with the right self-help book or the right expert advice. And there's so much judgment surrounding marriage and divorce that people really feel obligated to go and see an expert and to try to sort out their problems. But they don't always know what their own goals are, and they don't always have the conversation with the therapist about what the therapist is qualified or not qualified to help with and whether the therapist's goals align with their own. So whether it's before marriage or during marriage, I think what's really important is to be very crisp about what the qualifications are of the counselor and what everyone who's in the room wants. Because if one person is thinking, I just want to get divorced, and the other person is trying to save the marriage, and the counselor has no idea what either of them are thinking, it just turns into a big mess.
It sounds also as though having that conversation about what is your goal is already a big step forward on getting appropriate counseling.
Yeah, because, every marriage is different. And some people really do have problems with conflict and having conflict, resolving conflict, and they can really benefit from advice about how to deal with conflict better. But other marriages are falling apart for other reasons. Sometimes there's just not enough love to keep the couple stuck together, and they might have no conflict at all. Sometimes it's just they have no more passion for each other. So I think each case is different, and I think you have to be realistic about how much an expert can help.
We have a shorthand, another character to help people think about how to be crisp about this that we call the marriage fairy. So you run this thought experiment if you're considering a divorce, and we would recommend that both people considering the future of their marriage should separately run this thought experiment, which is if you met the marriage fairy who could wave her magic wand and cause any future that you wanted, what is the future you would pick? Because in some couples, they're having a lot of conflict. They're not happy in their marriage, but both of them in their most honest, innermost selves would wish that the marriage fairy would wave her wand and cause them to be in their marriage and just be magically happy. Then actually their marriage has a chance, and that's probably the best case scenario for them going together to a counselor. If either of them says in their innermost heart, you know what I really want is to be divorced, but somehow for the kids to be okay and for my spouse to be okay and nobody to be mad at me, if that's what their secret wish is, if that's what they would tell the marriage fairy, probably going to a marriage counselor is just going to be a charade that upsets everybody because that's not really, they're not trying to fix their marriage.
Now, you folks were both divorced and then got together and got married, and then you decided to write the book, Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage. What was it like writing this book together, and how is your marriage today?
The book writing process was really a brainstorming process. So every time we would sit down to talk about the subject when it was still raw, once we decided we wanted to write something down, we started taking notes and just threw a whole bunch of notes into a document. And then later I went back and sorted it into some things that look more like chapters. And so we didn't actually write paragraph by paragraph together. It was really written together in that we came up with the ideas together. And I'll have Astro talk about the state of the union.
Okay.
So Danielle's being very modest. We brainstormed the book together, and then she did most of the writing, so it was a relatively friction-free process, but that's because she did most of the work. No, but our marriage is great, and I think that one of the reasons that our marriage is great is that we did have some of these conversations coming in about what we expected from the marriage. So when we got married, on the day of our marriage, our wedding vows themselves sounded like the, bad marriage contract stuff that we were talking about earlier in this program. But before we got married, we said to each other, look, we understand how this works. I hope I'll be in love with you for the rest of my life. I would be very surprised if I turn out not to be in love with you. That's what my love feels like on the inside right now. But of course, I can't promise how I'm going to feel any more than I can promise to love chocolate 20 years from now. And you need to know that going in so that if I were to stop loving you, I'm not breaking some promise that you had understood I had made. And that we did that, I think, is one of a few of the sort of expectation settings that has helped us be in a really good place right now.
You're listening to Astro Teller. He and his wife Danielle Teller are co-authors of Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage. Dr. Danielle Teller has held faculty positions at the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University, where she investigated the origins of chronic lung disease and taught in the medical intensive care unit. Dr. Astro Teller is a computer scientist and entrepreneur who currently oversees X. That's part of Alphabet, the umbrella company that also owns Google.
And I take away from this conversation the idea that we should try pretty hard to know what it is we want and then try to figure out how we would achieve it.
Absolutely. It's really important to know your goals. Joe, I think I can be pretty confident that I'm still going to love chocolate 20 years from now. I'm almost equally confident I'm still going to love you 20 years from now.
Well, we have been married, let's see, have I got it right, 46 years?
Yes, you do have it right.
And they have been a wonderful 46 years, and I would love to look forward to the next 20 or however long we have together. Mm-hmm. It's been marvelous. Well, we do need to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to find out about that defective cow in our barn full of sacred cows.
What happens when a couple has a serious discrepancy in their interest in sex?
Well, it turns out that sexual problems are one of the big issues in a lot of marriages, so we will explore that in a little detail. And we'll also try to find out what can couples do to avoid the shame, fear, and guilt that often goes with sexual difficulties.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
And if you would like to purchase a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1059. The number again, 800-732-2334, or you can place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today, our topic is relationships. There's a lot of social pressure to keep people together, even when the marriage isn't going well.
We're talking with Astro and Danielle Teller, co-authors of Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage.
In writing Sacred Cows, you came up with a cow that many people may relate to, and it's the defective cow. So I wonder if you could go into a little detail about that defective cow belief system, especially with regard to sex.
Sure. So the overarching idea that the defective cow tries to foist upon married people is that if you can't make your marriage happy, and especially if you're considering leaving your marriage, that you must be defective in some way. There's something wrong with you, that is how you feel or what you want to do. And just one aspect of that has to do with libido. There's been a lot in the news in the last decade about, the search for libido drugs for women since the advent of Viagra for men. And this idea that there are a lot of people in long-term monogamous relationships who have low desire. It's pretty common. I believe you actually had Esther Perel as one of the guests on your show at one point, and I know she wrote a lot about that in the book that she wrote on mating in captivity. But the idea is that we treat low libido as a medical condition, and sometimes it is. There are medical situations where people have low desire because they might have diabetes and poor circulatory flow, or they may be depressed or have other psychological or psychiatric issues. But we don't like to think about the possibility that sometimes people just drift apart and fall out of love. And you may still love your spouse, but you may not want to have sex with your spouse in the same way that you love your best friend, but don't want to have sex with your best friend. So the attraction to your mate may just vanish in some situations. And the reason we don't want to talk about that as a society is because we don't know what to do with it. We don't want to tell people that they should really have sex with someone they're not attracted to, because that feels pretty icky, telling people to do that. We're also not comfortable telling people that they should either, get divorced and look for a new partner or seek passion outside of their marriage, because we're not up with that as a society. And so what we do instead is we make the people with low libido feel that they're defective, that there's something wrong with them fundamentally. And we think that is harmful because it leads people to have low self-esteem and to really to blame themselves for something for which they are probably blameless.
The social narrative in this case is usually that it's the woman who is just not interested. I have a headache, whatever the excuse may be. However, what we have observed is that it's just as likely to be the guy who may have lost interest in having relations with the person that he is now bonded to.
That's right, and I think that's actually good evidence that there's a strong emotional component, because not everything can be fixed with Viagra. You can't make yourself be attracted to somebody.
So what do we do about this belief system in the defective cow? How do you combat that, Sacred Cow?
Well, what we would suggest is that if you look at the standard set of self-help books, they have all of these suggestions about lighting candles and working on your listening skills and wearing silk shirts or whatever it is that's supposed to rekindle passion. If you go to a marriage counselor, they will ask you a whole bunch of questions. They will give you a whole bunch of exercises. But what you will not find in any of those books or from the marriage counselor is the question, are you still in love with your spouse? Because if the answer is no, I have great affection for this other person, but I'm no longer in love, the answer may well be there's no resolution here. But if you're peddling solutions, you don't want to ask a question for which there's no solution. So our proposal is at least get it out on the table that there might be no solution. Create a place free of fear and shame, free of the guilt that Danielle just mentioned, for people to be able to say whether or not they still feel that they're in love with their significant other. And if the answer is yes, great. Then we can work on the conflict and the other things that might be getting in the way. You know, our kids are crawling all over the bed. Of course we never have sex, honey. Or we fight too much and then I'm not in the mood. But if the answer is, no, I have affection for you. I hope you have a great life. I'd miss not being around you, but I just am not in love with you. You're no longer my paramour. Then we shouldn't try to fix something which is not fundamentally fixable. If that were fixable, self-help books and dieting books and marriage counseling would all be vanishingly small businesses compared to the value of that pill, which people could eat and just be in love with whoever they wanted to be in love with.
And we wouldn't have to date. We could just marry the first person we meet and then just flip the switch and be in love. It'd be a lot easier.
It would certainly be a lot easier. Now, we've talked about shame and fear and guilt, and I think that there is a very pervasive idea in society that if you get divorced, then that marriage was a failure. And I was intrigued to read your quote from Margaret Mead. I have great affection for Margaret Mead as an anthropologist. So I hope that you will share her perspective on divorce.
Yeah, well, so I don't remember the quote verbatim, but it was basically that we have an obligation to right all the other wrongs that we make in our lives, but that in the case of divorce, sort of fixing the wrong is considered failure.
No, Margaret Mead said, I've had 3 divorces and
that's right.
3 marriages and all of them were successes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so she felt that all of her marriages for the time that they worked were perfect for her and for that time. And when she got to a place where it wasn't working for her or for her spouse, that it was time for it to be over. But that didn't mean that the years before that were a failure. And I think it's a very healthy perspective for her to have taken.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny attitude for us to have, actually, which is this holdover that Danielle mentioned before from the last several thousand years of human history, where we were using marriage as this institution where it was important that it continued until you died because of the issues around money, for example. But you wouldn't say that if you went to college and then you decided to leave college after 4 years, that college was a failure. Like, it was right for you at that time in your life, but there's no reason you would do it forever. And we live now so much longer than we used to. For many people, it could make sense for them to be married to somebody for 20 years, have had a wonderful relationship with them, grow apart, end amicably, find someone who's now in a place more like the one that they've grown into, and then have a second great marriage. And I don't think that that's a rejection of the concept of marriage or of the first person they were married to.
And it's not that everybody has successful marriages. Just like moving on from a job doesn't mean that you were a failure at your earlier job. Sometimes you are a failure at your job, though. I mean, sometimes you're just bad at it. And there are certainly people who are not great at marriage and who have problems repeatedly, whether it's because they have problems with substance abuse or anger management, or, there are some people who are not as great at relationships than others. But I think this sort of blanket idea that anyone who leaves a relationship is a failure, or that the relationship is a failure, is something that needs to be rewritten.
Danielle, as a physician, you are very familiar with bell-shaped curves. And I suspect as a technical guy, you're familiar with them too, Astro. So I like to think of marriages in the form of a bell-shaped curve. So at the bottom of that curve, you've got some really crappy marriages. I mean, it's like, wow, how did they do that? What were they thinking? And, within a few days, weeks, or months, it's like, that one just isn't working. And then as you go up that bell-shaped curve, you move into the not so good, maybe getting along, maybe we'll hang out for a while and see how this works. And then there's that vast middle territory, which is like okay marriages. not great, not terrible, just sort of like okay. And then as you move towards the right side of that bell-shaped curve, you get into that rarefied atmosphere where, wow, can you believe it? They've been married 53 years and they are still as in love today as they were 53 years ago when they first got married. And we've all seen marriages that are just like unbelievable, extraordinary. And so I guess as you look at your sacred cows, what does that bell-shaped curve mean to you? And how do we understand the bad, the medium, and the really great?
Wow, that's a big question. So I'll start with a couple of observations. I think that, one of the things that the sacred cows love to talk about is how the grass is never greener. And there's this idea that you never marry the wrong person. There was an article in the New York Times recently that was very popular about the fact that you never marry the wrong person. And that finding happiness in marriage is really just learning how to have conflict and learning to be grateful and doing what it takes to be happy. I personally reject that idea. I think that there is a right and a wrong person for people to be with. So there are a lot of reasons why marriages can fail, and certainly at the tail end where the marriages are doing terribly, I think a lot of times the people in those marriages, one or both of those people, are struggling with a lot of, psychological problems or other issues in their lives, poverty, things that just make their lives very stressful. And in the middle are a bunch of people who may be perfectly matched but don't get along so well, don't treat each other as well as they should, and so on. Some people who are maybe not as well matched, but they can tolerate each other. They get a lot out of the relationship. They get, support and great parenting from the other person. So even though they're not perfect together, they can make it work. And then I think at the other end of the tail, where the marriages are just great, my own personal belief, and this is not backed up by data, is that these people were lucky enough to find someone who was a really great match for them. And they also just happen to have the skills that it takes, not to drive each other crazy and not to insult each other when they're having arguments and all those sorts of things that cause hard feelings. So I think there's a ton of luck involved. And the only little bit of sort of it is scientific evidence, came from, and I'm blanking on her name, but Terry probably knows who this is, this woman who's been studying, an anthropologist who's been studying romantic love for many years. And she does these studies where she puts people in
Fisher, I think is her name.
Yes, I think that's right. And so she did these studies with people who had been married for decades and showed them photographs of their spouses or their partners in the relationship, and found that there was a very small subset of people where the parts of their brain that light up in couples who are infatuated in the first throes of love light up, that for some of these couples who have been married for a very long time, those parts of their brain still light up. And I just think they got lucky, that they just really got lucky to be with the right person.
Well, I would like to ask each of you to please offer us something that we can take away with us from your wonderful book, Sacred Cows, and from our conversation today. Danielle, would you like to start?
Sure. I think the most important takeaway that I hope people will get from the book is that there's nothing shameful about not being happy in your marriage, and nothing shameful about considering whether ending your marriage is the right solution to being unhappy. And that many of the ideas that our society has about marriage and divorce, you can deal with them and sort of package them up and put them on a shelf if you just examine them in the light of logic, which is what we try to do in the book. And when you do that, you see that a lot of these ideas that you may be carrying around with you, which is that you're a selfish person or you're not a hardworking person if you can't get your marriage to work, that those just don't make sense once you deconstruct them.
Astro, today you get the last word.
I would recommend that your listeners imagine back to a time when someone they knew was getting divorced. I think most of us have had the experience that when a friend of ours comes and tells us that they're getting divorced, the sacred cows may show up some, but we do hold them at bay because it's a friend of ours and we're trying to be on their side a bit. But when it comes to talking about their spouse, who they're often very mad at, there's a stampede of the sacred cows. When it comes to people beating themselves up about ending their marriage, they let the sacred cows walk all over them. And I would recommend to your listeners, if we can all try to be that best friend part of ourselves when we're holding the sacred cows a little bit at bay and just having compassion while we talk to our friend, while we talk about someone like the spouse of our friend, even if there's anger between the two of them right now, when we think about ourselves, we should cut everybody some slack and hold the sacred cows at bay for everyone, just like we do for our best friend.
Astro Teller, Danielle Teller, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. It was delightful.
Thanks for having us with you today.
You've been listening to Astro and Danielle Teller, co-authors of Sacred Cows, The Truth About Divorce and Marriage. Dr. Danielle Teller has held faculty positions at the University of Pittsburgh and Harvard University, where she investigated the origins of chronic lung disease and taught in the medical intensive care unit. Dr. Astro Teller is a computer scientist and entrepreneur who currently oversees X. That's part of Alphabet, the umbrella company that also owns Google.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream, with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can place that order by phone. The number is 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1059. The number again, 800-732-2334. You can also place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your thoughts on today's show. We'd love to have your feedback. In the future, we'll be talking with a marriage counselor on how people can make their relationships work better, so stay tuned.
At our website, you could also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You can listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.